Welcome to Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography. And today I'm talking about the 2006 survival drama World Trade Center. World Trade Center is the true story of two Port Authority police officers who were in the North Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11th when the towers collapsed on top of them, trapping them under the rubble. And the film shows their struggle to stay alive while rescuers search for survivors. Call me a cynic, but whenever somebody releases a piece of art or entertainment depicting a real-life tragic event, part of me is always like, was this made with the best intentions, or is it like a cheap, exploitative way to make money?
Alan Jackson is, of course, the man who wrote the song Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning about the tragedies on September 11th. And now he's here once again to capitalize on people's emotions.
Maybe, like I said, I'm being overly cynical. But on the other hand, look at all these terrible looking movies about COVID that got churned out a couple of years ago. But I think the film we're talking about today, World Trade Center, is coming from a genuine and fairly well-intended place. It was released 5 years after 9/11, which personally I think is still a little bit too soon. But as far as I can tell, a lot of effort went into making this movie historically accurate. They had real policemen and firemen playing some of the roles and often wrote their own dialogue. And John McLaughlin and Will Jimeno, the real-life counterparts of Nick Cage and Michael Pena in the movie, were involved with the writing and overall production of the film. In my research, I watched quite a lot of interviews with Will Jimeno, and almost all of what he said while recounting his story is in this movie.
He said to Sergeant McLaughlin, you know, can I get a 3-8, which is our code for a break? And Sergeant McLaughlin, even through his pain, said, yeah, take a 3-8.
Can I get a 3-8, Sarge?
Yeah, Dom. You take a break.
There's a pretty surreal part in the film where we see a vision of a faceless Jesus Christ in a grassy meadow holding a bottle of water. And even that actually happened. Well, when I say that actually happened, I can't confirm or deny whether Jesus projected a vision to the man. But what I mean is Will Jimeno described seeing that exact image of Jesus after being underground for 9 hours. So even the hallucinations he had are depicted accurately. And John McLaughlin and Will Jimeno have a nice little cameo at the end of the movie. So these things reassure me that it's a bit more than a quick cash grab to capitalize on people's emotions. There are several inaccuracies in the depiction of the true story, which I'll talk about later. But what was a big red flag initially for a lot of people was the choice of director of the film, Oliver Stone. Partially because he has a reputation of making highly politicized and controversial movies, like JFK, which heavily explored conspiracy theories. So people were concerned that maybe his World Trade Center movie would be about it being an inside job. It also didn't help that 3 weeks after the attack on September 11th, Oliver Stone called 9/11 a revolt and compared it to the French and Russian Revolution, and also went on to say, does anybody make the connection between the 2000 election and the events of September 11th? Let's look for the 13th month. Look for Santa Claus, huh? To be honest, I don't even know what in the hell that means, but it sounds pretty controversial. And in response, Christopher Hitchens called him an idiot and said that the man had completely lost it. So of course, 5 years after that, Oliver Stone was chosen to direct a big-budget 9/11 movie. But having seen the movie, you can tell that Oliver Stone put all his controversial and conscientious takes aside. In an interview about World Trade Center, Oliver Stone said on the topic of making controversial films, I stopped. The mantra is, this is not a political film. I don't know if it's truly possible for any film to be apolitical. For example, my last review was a movie that was a cartoon about ants, and I still found a way to bring up communism. But the movie does certainly play it safe politically, and it doesn't really take a stance for the most part. Even its depiction of the tower attacks are subtle. We never actually see either plane hit. Instead, we just get a brief shot of one of the planes via shadow, and we know what's about to happen. The screenwriter Andrea Berloff said, I didn't want to see the planes hit the buildings. We've seen enough of that footage forever, it's not adding anything new at this point. Which I think is completely valid. In 2006, everybody had that image of the plane hitting the tower ingrained in their head. So I actually do admire that the movie went for a more subtle approach. The movie also relies quite a lot on reaction shots to convey the tragedy, and they actually use real footage of people reacting at one point. There's barely anything gory in the movie. The film is a PG-13, so the most we really get are a couple of brief shots of people soaked in blood, and the audience is smart enough to know the implications of that. But this movie is less about showcasing the devastation, and instead concentrates upon a more personal human story. It's really a microcosm of that day. Genre-wise, I guess you could call the film a disaster movie, but it doesn't really feel like a conventional one. It's not Steve McQueen trying to escape from a towering inferno for 2.5 hours. The bulk of the movie is about two men immobilized under concrete, and people don't even know where they are for a lot of the film. I've seen World Trade Center compared to a made-for-TV film, maybe because of its smaller scale, but I think production-wise for 2006 it looks pretty good. And also because it's about two guys buried in the concrete in the pitch dark, it's obviously very claustrophobic and very dark visually and a bit hard to see at times. But of course that's justified in the plot. And it's not like in Game of Thrones where you go, there must have been a more visually appealing way to show the darkness. Because most of the time in World Trade Center there's a slither of light for us to just see enough. I've seen some people argue that having the movie just be about two people under the rubble is too small of a scale for a movie about 9/11. But I personally like the smaller scale, character-driven approach that the movie takes. And I think it was an interesting choice to tell the story from September 11th that actually had a happy ending. And I suppose you can contrast that with the other big 9/11 movie released in 2006, United 93. Full disclosure, I've never actually seen United 93. I've heard that it's excellent, and I'm sure it is. But the idea of watching a movie about this doomed flight, knowing how it all ends, just seems too upsetting to me. Whereas with World Trade Center, there's a bit of hope there. Obviously, the movie is still depressing. Even though it has a happy ending for John McLaughlin and Wilhelmina, there wasn't a happy ending for many people that day, or even for the three colleagues of our two central protagonists. In Roger Ebert's review, he brought up that quote that goes around about how somebody said to Stanley Kubrick that Schindler's List is a good representation of the Holocaust. And Stanley Kubrick replied, the Holocaust is about 6 million people who got killed. Schindler's List is about 600 who don't. When you look at it like that, 9/11 was about 2,977 people who got killed, and World Trade Center is about 2 people who didn't. But despite that, I do think that the movie finds a way to be uplifting without feeling too contrived. At its core, it's a story about people coming together in the face of adversity, be it Wilhelmina keeping his sergeant alive, or the people who wouldn't give up on the search, and I think that's an important story to be told. So I talked about the lack of a political agenda to the film, but I think the closest the movie comes to being politicized is through Michael Shannon's character. He plays a man named David Carnes, a retired Marine who upon hearing about the attack got a haircut, went to church, and then drove to Ground Zero where he eventually helped find Wilhelmina, and he later re-enlisted in the Marines, where he served 2 tours of duty in Iraq. And based on my research, all of that is true as far as I can tell. But honestly, I had a bit of an issue with a lot of its scenes in the movie.
God gave me a gift to be able to help people, to defend our country. I feel him calling on me now for this mission.
It's like God made a curtain with the smoke, shielding us from what we're not yet ready to see. We're gonna need some good men out there to avenge this.
I want to make it clear that I'm in no way mocking a man's religious beliefs, and I have no criticism to the real-life person David Carnes. He obviously did a really selfless thing that day. But all of that God made us a curtain to shield us stuff is really corny to me. I actually found a clip where he said that on that day he prayed and said, "Please God, use me to defend my country." So maybe the dialogue was accurate to who he is. But my issue is more with the way the movie presents the character. The music swells whenever he talks, and it's like he almost talks directly to the camera whenever he's saying something profound. It just feels a bit stilted and Hollywood in a way none of the other characters really do. And in fact, test audiences at the time actually thought the character was made up for the movie. But one of the reasons as to why his dialogue is less realistic than everybody else's is because David Carnes declined participating in the making of the movie due to Oliver Stone's antipathy towards George Bush. And a part of me does worry that the filmmakers used him to pander towards the jingoistic crowd. But it's really only the Michael Shannon parts of the movie that feels like that. In terms of other liberties that the movie took with the true story, the actual rescue itself in the film is shown to be a lot less arduous and harrowing than it really was. In the movie, once they get found, it's not long until everything's okay. But in reality, once he was found, it ended up taking 3 hours to save Wilhelmina, and another 9 or so after that to get to John McLaughlin. And even after being rescued, Wilhelmina flatlined twice, and John McLaughlin was read his last rites twice, neither of which is shown in the film. The screenwriter even said that what happened to John and Will in that hospital could be a movie in itself. But at that point in the movie, the film is entering the uplifting part, so I guess they didn't want to fully show the reality. But the biggest blunder in the movie is its depiction of Jason Thomas, a Marine who helped find Wilhelmina. In the movie, he's portrayed by William Mapother. I know him as the guy who played Ethan in Lost. But the problem is, here's what the real Jason Thomas looked like. That's quite a bit of a difference. In the filmmaker's defense, Jason Thomas's identity wasn't made public for a long time. He wanted to stay anonymous, and he didn't even tell his family about what really happened until the movie came out. But I feel like there must have been somebody that the filmmakers could have talked to that knew what he looked like. I mean, there's pictures of him at Ground Zero, and there's even a video of him sprinting towards the towers, which honestly, that's a striking image. Look at all those people walking away from the ash and he's running towards it. Jason Thomas's family saw the casting of a white man in the role as a fundamental mistake, and Oliver Stone actually wrote him a letter of apology. But thankfully, the real Jason Thomas didn't seem to mind about being played by a white guy. He was just glad that the story was being told, and the only thing that bothered him was that the guy playing him was wearing a hard hat and not a Marine Corps cap like he did. I've already talked about Michael Shannon and Ethan from Lost, so let's talk about the rest of the cast, starting with Nicolas Cage. This is understandably a fairly subdued performance from Nicolas Cage. You get a couple of screams out of him, but they're not the fun Nicolas Cage screams, they're raw and visceral.
Well, see, you gotta talk to me, cause I can't, because my knees are crushed again. That's why I can't fucking talk.
But outside of that, he's very quiet and low-key for most of the movie. It's interesting to see him in a performance like this, because even though on this channel I've already covered some of his more subdued acting roles, this is possibly his most restrained. And literally, he's a man restrained by rubble struggling to keep conscious. So obviously, Nicolas Cage can't use that lively physicality that he's known for. Apparently, while preparing for the role, Nicolas Cage spent hours in a sensory deprivation tank in order to capture the fear and claustrophobia of John McLaughlin's ordeal. And I do think that Nicolas Cage gives a very strong performance here. And I also love that despite the subject matter, this movie still manages to have a moment where Nick Cage kinda sings, and it somehow doesn't feel out of place.
Yeah, that's it. You got it. We got Frank Sinatra over here.
Michael Pena is also great as Will Jimeno. In real life, John McLaughlin was positioned about 15 feet further away from Will Jimeno into the rubble. So Will Jimeno knew that he had to stay alive because if he died, nobody would ever find John McLaughlin. So to keep them both conscious, he just kept on talking. So this is pretty great casting because as we know from his later career, Michael Pena is great at playing a chatterbox. And the scenes with him chatting for his life with Nicolas Cage are very entertaining. I enjoyed the dialogue with Cage about G.I. Jane and Starsky and Hutch. It's a testament to the performers in this movie that they were able to make these scenes with two immobilized men that we can barely see so interesting. The movie does cut away from the two central characters quite often. I assume to keep the pacing from getting stale. We see what their wives are going through at several points, and there's several other subplots and even a few flashbacks. And while some of those scenes are well done, I did find myself thinking a few times, alright movie, let's go back to Nick Cage and Michael Pena together because I like those scenes so much. I'm not gonna go into depth with the rest of the cast, but pretty much everybody does a solid job, including Maria Bello, Maggie Gyllenhaal, the children in the film are all great actors, and even Viola Davis, who's only in the movie for a couple of minutes, still manages to give a powerhouse performance. So overall, this movie is pretty good for what it is. I think that it succeeds on what it sets out to do, and that's to tell a true story of tragedy, but also a story of hope and heroism. And 5 years after 9/11, I think a lot of people needed that. It's well acted and generally well made, and I liked how personal the story was. As I mentioned, it's a little corny at times, and they took a few liberties with the truth here and there, including a pretty major screw-up. But having read a few articles and watched a few interviews about the true story, I think it's probably more accurate than most based on true story movies are once you look into them. And I think at the very least the movie came from a well-meaning place. I don't know if I'd go so far to say that I highly recommend it, because when so many good movies exist, it feels strange to go, you know what movie you should watch tonight? The Nicolas Cage movie about 9/11. But if you are one of those people who enjoy watching movies about tragic events, then sure, it's a decent film. And if you want to learn more about the specific events that this movie is about, then I also suggest watching the documentary 9/11 The Lost Hero, which is currently available on YouTube. So the next movie Nicolas Cage was in was The Wicker Man, so until next time guys, thanks for watching.